Welcome to Imperial History, the podcast where we explore the epic stories of empires that shaped the world, from their triumphant rises to their dramatic falls. I'm your host, Eric Alexander. In our last episode, we left on a rather dramatic note, the Battle of Guadalete, where King Roderick, the last king of the Visigoths, was cut down as 7,000 determined and battle-hardened Muslim soldiers swept north from Gibraltar into the heart of Hispania. What followed would change the fate of the Iberian Peninsula forever. But before we move forward into the chaos of invasion and rebellion, let's rewind a bit and dig into the story of a man who would unexpectedly become one of the most pivotal figures of this time, Pelagius, or as the Spanish call him, Don Pelayo. Who was he? That's a mystery wrapped in centuries of myth and legend. Even the chroniclers of his time couldn't agree on his origins. Some say he was a Visigothic nobleman, a descendant of the old warrior aristocracy that had ruled Hispania since the fall of the Roman Empire. Others claim he was of Roman lineage, a symbol of the old imperial bloodlines lingering in the shadows of a crumbling post-Roman world. What most sources do agree on is this: Pelagius and his family had been victims of the brutal political power struggles that consumed the Visigothic court. One name stands out in this story: Wititza, a king remembered by later historians as corrupt, cruel, and dangerously unpredictable. It's said that Wititza had Pelagius exiled from the royal city of Toledo, banishing him to the far northern reaches of Hispania, beyond the mountains, and into the wild and remote territory of Asturias. Now, at the time, this probably felt like the worst possible fate for Pelagius, a death sentence for his family's ambitions, cutting them off from the power and influence of the Visigothic court. Imagine it. You've grown up in a world where wealth and status are everything, where alliances are built on who you know at court, and suddenly you're cast out into the wilderness, watching from the sidelines as the political drama unfolds in Toledo, powerless to change your fate. But here's where the story takes a wild turn. That exile may have saved his life. When the Muslim armies under Tariq ibn Ziyad landed on the southern shores of Hispania in 711, Toledo, the city where Pelagius might have once lived, was directly in their path. King Roderick, already weakened by internal divisions and struggling to hold his kingdom together, was overwhelmed. The Visigothic forces were shattered at Guadalete, and within months, much of the peninsula was under Muslim control. Had Pelagius remained in Toledo, he would likely have shared the same fate as so many Visigothic nobles, dead, enslaved, or forced to submit to the new rulers of Hispania. Instead, he was far away in the rugged, unforgiving north, a place the Muslim invaders initially had little interest in. It was a region known for its isolation and fierce independence, where the people had never fully embraced the rule of distant kings, whether Roman, Visigothic, or otherwise. And here's where we begin to see the outlines of the legend. So here we are. It's 718, and by this point, Hispania, or what's left of it, is almost unrecognizable. The Muslim armies, initially just 7,000 men under the command of Tariq ibn Ziyad, had grown into a tide of reinforcements under Musa ibn Nusayr, the formidable governor of Ifriqiya. With every passing year, they pushed further and further into the peninsula, tightening their grip. The Visigothic kingdom had been obliterated. Its last remnants, once clinging to life in the northeastern region we now call Catalonia, were led by Ardo, a shadow of what the Visigothic kings once were. Some say Ardo fought until his death, desperately trying to hold back the inevitable. Others claim he made a deal with the new Muslim rulers, securing a place for himself as a representative of Christian interests in the Islamic court. Either way, it didn't matter in the long run. When the Muslims finally captured Narbonensis, the last Visigothic stronghold, the conquest was complete. The Visigoths were gone. Their kingdom had fallen into history like so many before it, another casualty in the endless churn of empires. And as often happens in history, some adapted and survived, bending the knee to the new rulers. The nobility began swearing oaths of loyalty to the Umayyad Caliphate. Even the family of the former King Witiza, whose rule had been so disastrous, now found themselves negotiating favorable terms with the new masters of Hispania. They chose survival over honor, submitting to Muslim rule in exchange for land, wealth, or simply the chance to keep breathing. But there was one man who refused to kneel. In 718, Pelagius, this once exiled noble, was elected as the leader of Asturias, the rugged mountainous region in the far north. Now, if you're imagining Asturias as a safe, peaceful haven in these chaotic times, think again. The north of Hispania was a wild, harsh place, filled with steep mountains, deep valleys, and people who had always lived on the edge of the world. They weren't city dwellers or courtly aristocrats. They were herders and warriors, fiercely independent and deeply suspicious of any authority beyond their local chieftains. Pelagius started by rallying the local population, building a small but determined force from the rugged highlands of Asturias. At first, it might have seemed like a fool's errand. What chance did a handful of mountain warriors have against the most powerful empire in the world? The Umayyad Caliphate stretched from the Atlantic to the Indus. They had crushed the Visigoths, who were a professional military force, and yet here was Pelagius, leading what was essentially a guerrilla uprising in the backwoods of Hispania. When the Muslims swept across the peninsula, they brought with them a highly organized system of governance. Taxation was key to maintaining control, and non-Muslims, dhimmis, were required to pay the jizya, a tax that symbolized submission to Islamic rule. Most of the surviving Visigothic elite accepted it. After all, if you could keep your land, your title, and avoid execution by paying a tax, it wasn't the worst deal in history. But Pelagius refused. Refusing to pay the jizya was a declaration of rebellion. The refugees who had fled north to escape Muslim rule were ripe for recruitment. Many were former soldiers, aristocrats, or dispossessed farmers who had lost everything when the Visigothic kingdom fell. These people had nothing left to lose, and in the wild mountains of Asturias, they found something they hadn't had in years: a leader and a cause worth fighting for. Pelagius's first moves were hit-and-run attacks, the kind of guerrilla tactics that work best in rough terrain. They struck at small Muslim garrisons, then melted back into the mountains before reinforcements could arrive. And in one of his boldest early moves, Pelagius drove out the provincial governor, Munuza, and took control of large parts of Asturias. At first, Cordoba barely noticed. The Umayyad Caliphate had bigger fish to fry. Their eyes were on Narbonne and Gaul, where Muslim forces were raiding deep into Frankish territory, eyeing the heart of Europe. In comparison, the rebellion in Asturias seemed like a minor nuisance, a mosquito bite in the grand scheme of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indus. For years, the response was half-hearted at best. Occasional expeditions were sent into the mountains to deal with Pelagius, but the Muslim commanders found the terrain difficult and the enemy elusive. They would temporarily establish control, only to have Pelagius reappear as soon as they left. This wasn't a conventional war. It was something older, something tribal, fought in the hills and forests where armies couldn't maneuver, where supply lines were impossible to maintain. The Umayyads didn't see Pelagius as a true threat, and perhaps at the time he wasn't. He had no grand army, no organized state, just a growing network of mountain warriors who refused to be conquered. What kept him alive wasn't sheer strength. It was the fact that the Umayyads didn't have the manpower or the interest to fully crush his insurrection. But the rebellion refused to die. Then, something happened that changed everything. In the early 720s, the Umayyads suffered a major defeat, not in Asturias, but far away in Gaul, at the hands of the Franks. The governor of Al-Andalus, formerly Hispania, set his sights on the city of Toulouse. Toulouse was a prize worth taking, and the man leading the Umayyad force, Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khawlani, the governor of Al-Andalus, intended to seize it. Al-Sam had reason to feel confident. After all, no one had successfully stopped the Umayyads since they first set foot in Iberia. City after city had fallen, and local rulers either submitted or perished. This campaign was supposed to be no different. But it didn't quite go as planned. Duke Odo wasn't in Toulouse when the siege began. His absence seemed like a stroke of good luck for the besieging force. With their leader gone, the city's defenders were isolated, outnumbered, and doomed to fall. Odo, however, wasn't running away. He was searching for reinforcements, trying to muster whatever help he could from his allies to the north. He gathered what he could: Aquitanian, Gascon, and even some Frankish troops, and marched back to Toulouse. By this point, the city was on the brink of collapse. Al-Sam and his forces had been hammering its walls for months. Supplies were running out, and surrender seemed inevitable. But here's where the overconfidence of the Umayyad army became their downfall. Convinced that victory was only days away, they had grown careless. They didn't bother maintaining outer defenses around their camp. They stopped sending out regular patrols to scout for threats. Why would they? The city was theirs for the taking, or so they thought. Then, on June 9th, 721, Odo returned. It was an attack, straight out of a military manual on how not to let your guard down during a siege. Odo's forces struck hard, hitting the Umayyads from two directions, from within the city walls and from behind with his newly assembled army. The Umayyads were caught completely off guard. They had been expecting surrender, not a counterattack, and when the assault came, it came with terrifying speed and precision. Chaos erupted in the siege camp. The Umayyad soldiers, many of them resting unarmed or scattered, had no time to organize a defense. Odo's forces cut them down where they stood. Some tried to fight back. Most ran for their lives. The result was a massacre. Those who fled were cut down in the surrounding countryside, hunted by Odo's men in brutal pursuit. The siege had turned into a slaughter. Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khawlani, the once proud governor of Al-Andalus, managed to escape, but with only a fraction of his army. He would later die of injuries from the battle. Suddenly, the expansion of the caliphate into Europe ground to a halt. The strategic focus shifted, resources were redirected, and the rebellion in Asturias, this seemingly insignificant thorn in their side, was no longer just a local problem. The stage was now set for something legendary. History can be tricky. Sometimes we look back and see what appears to be a grand, defining moment, a heroic stand that changes everything. But often, when we dig a little deeper, we find that these events weren't so clear-cut at the time. The Battle of Covadonga is one of those moments. Depending on which account you read, Covadonga was either a turning point in history, the first real victory of the native peoples of Hispania over the Muslim invaders, or just an insignificant skirmish, barely worth mentioning in contemporary records. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. By 722, Pelagius and his followers had become a thorn in the side of the Umayyad authorities in the region. Some sources claim that the Muslim forces sent to confront him were battle-hardened troops retreating from Gaul, who were looking for an easy victory after their losses in the north. Others say it was just a large patrol, sent to crush this lingering nuisance in the mountains once and for all. Regardless of the reason, something happened at Covadonga, something that would echo through the centuries. According to Christian sources, this was the first significant victory over the Muslims in open battle. This wasn't just another raid or skirmish. This was a real fight, and it ended with a massive Muslim defeat. But how accurate are those accounts? That's where things get murky. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, one of the few Christian sources that provides a near-contemporary account of the major events in Hispania, doesn't even mention Covadonga. Meanwhile, Arabic sources either downplay it as a minor skirmish or ignore it altogether. So what really happened? Here's what we know, or at least what the later chronicles claim. Pelagius may have had as few as 300 men. Not exactly an army, even by the standards of the time. But if there's one thing history has shown us, it's that terrain matters. And the Asturian mountains were perfect for guerrilla warfare. Narrow passes, steep cliffs, thick forests,